Some bonds transcend death itself, some wounds never heal, and some acts of vengeance burn so deeply into the soul that they reshape the very fabric of nature. This is not a story about survival. This is a story about something far more dangerous. A son who refused to forget, a memory that transformed into obsession, and 400 days of relentless pursuit that would rewrite everything we thought we knew about lion intelligence, memory, and the capacity for revenge. His name was Taka, a young male lion barely 3 years old when his world shattered on a blood-soaked afternoon in Tanzania's Ruaha National Park. What he witnessed on March 18, 2019, would haunt him every single day for the next 13 months. His father, Jabari, the magnificent ruler of the Magusi territory, didn't just die. He was executed, murdered by a coalition of 3 rogue males in a coordinated attack so brutal that even the vultures circled for days afterward. But here's what makes this story extraordinary. Taka didn't run. He didn't submit to the new rulers. He didn't follow the ancient script that nature had written for defeated lions. Instead, from the shadows of thorny acacia trees and behind the cover of baobab giants, he watched, he learned, he memorized every scar on his father's killers, every roar, every movement pattern, every weakness. For 400 days, while the rest of the animal kingdom moved on, while seasons changed and herds migrated, Taka remained locked in a singular purpose that scientists initially refused to believe was even possible. He was planning, calculating, waiting for the perfect moment to do what no lion in documented history had ever done: hunt down his father's murderers one by one and make them pay for what they took from him. Before I reveal how this impossible hunt unfolded, you need to understand where it all began. You need to know the world Taka lost, the father who shaped him, and why the events of that terrible March afternoon would set in motion one of the most extraordinary examples of animal cognition ever recorded. Because what Taka did over the next 400 days would challenge everything scientists thought they understood about the emotional lives of lions. If you're fascinated by true wildlife stories that prove nature is far more complex than we ever imagined, subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell. You're about to witness something that will change how you see the animal kingdom forever. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching this from? I want to know how far this incredible story reaches. Now let's go back to the beginning, back to when Taka was just a cub, and his father Jabari ruled the Magusi territory like the king he was born to be. The year was 2016, and the Mawagusi region of Ruaha National Park was experiencing one of its most prosperous periods in decades. The great Ruaha River flowed with more water than usual, drawing massive herds of buffalo, zebra, and impala. For the lions who controlled this 45-square-kilometer paradise, life was abundant, and at the center of this kingdom stood Jabari. At 11 years old, Jabari was in his absolute prime, 420 pounds of battle-hardened muscle, with a mane so thick and dark it looked black in certain light. His shoulders carried scars from 100 fights, each one a testament to victories that had built his empire. Rangers who had tracked him for years spoke of him with reverence. Jabari doesn't just rule territory. One veteran guide named Joseph Mwenda would say, he commands respect from every living thing that crosses his path. Jabari's pride consisted of 6 adult lionesses, all exceptional hunters who could bring down buffalo 3 times their size. Together they had raised 14 cubs to adulthood over 8 years, an extraordinary success rate in the wild where 60% of cubs typically die before their 2nd birthday. The Magusi territory was so rich in prey that the pride rarely went hungry. Water holes dotted the landscape, providing reliable drinking sources even during the harshest dry seasons. But among all of Jabari's offspring, one cub stood out from the moment he opened his amber eyes in July 2016, Taka. The name means want or desire in Swahili, given to him by the park rangers who noticed something unusual about this particular male cub. Even at 6 weeks old, he never strayed far from his father's side. While his littermates tumbled and played with each other, Taka would sit perfectly still, watching Jabari's every move with an intensity that seemed almost unnatural for such a young animal. It was like he was studying him. Joseph would later recall, "I've been observing lions for 23 years, and I've never seen a cub pay such focused attention to the pride male. Most cubs are curious about everything. Taka was curious about one thing: his father. This bond between father and son was remarkable because male lions typically show limited interest in their cubs. They provide protection and mark territory, but the close, mentoring relationship that developed between Jabari and Taka defied normal lion social dynamics. By the time Taka was 8 months old, Jabari would take him on short patrols of the territory's borders, something usually reserved for much older males. The cub would walk directly in his father's massive paw prints, mimicking every pause, every scent marking, every territorial roar. Jabari seemed to tolerate, even encourage this behavior. He would demonstrate how to read the wind for approaching herds, how to identify the weakness in prey animals, and how to assess threats from the way dust clouds moved across the plains. Life in the Mogusi Pride followed a rhythm as ancient as Africa itself. Dawn hunts led by the lionesses, Jabari standing guard while the pride fed. Midday rest in the shade of tamboti trees. The entire pride clustered together in the relative cool. Evening patrols as Jabari marked his boundaries with urine and deep gouges in tree bark, asserting his dominance over every meter of his kingdom. And through it all, Taka watched, learned and absorbed lessons that would one day save his life. The pride's territory was strategically positioned around 3 permanent water sources, the most valuable real estate in the entire park. The central waterhole, called Madonia by locals, was fed by an underground spring that never completely dried. This guaranteed that prey animals would always come to drink, making hunting efficient and predictable. Control of Madonia meant control of life itself. In this section of Ruaha, Jabari defended this territory with absolute authority. Twice a year, during the peak mating seasons, nomadic males would challenge him for access to his pride and resources. Each time, Jabari drove them away with displays of power that left no doubt about who ruled Mogusi. His roar, measured at 114 decibels by researchers, could be heard up to 8 kilometers away, a sound that made every creature within range instinctively understand their place in the hierarchy. Young Taka grew strong on this foundation of stability and abundance. By his first birthday in July 2017, he was already larger than his littermates, his developing muscles hinting at the impressive build he would inherit from his father. But more importantly, he was sharper, more observant, more tactical in his play fighting with other cubs. He won these mock battles not through size advantage, but through strategy, waiting for his opponent to commit before counter-attacking with precise movements. The lionesses noticed. They would exchange glances when Taka executed a particularly clever flanking maneuver during cub play. He was different, special, and though no one could have known it then, he was being prepared for something that nature never intended, a test that would push lion cognition into territory scientists didn't believe existed. Throughout 2017 and into 2018, the Mogusi Pride thrived under Jabari's protection. Tourist vehicles would gather at respectful distances, cameras clicking as visitors from around the world witnessed one of Africa's most successful lion prides. Conservation groups cited Jabari's territory as a success story, proof that protected areas could sustain healthy predator populations when properly managed. But 30 kilometers to the north, in the harsher, drier region near the Moyembe River, 3 young males were coming of age. They had been cast out from their birth pride 8 months earlier, and they were hungry, desperate, and increasingly aggressive. They called themselves by no name, but the rangers who tracked them came to know them by their distinctive features. Scar, the largest, with a jagged mark running across his left eye from a fight with a porcupine. Damu, whose name means blood in Swahili, earned for the rust-colored stain on his chest fur. And Kivuli, Shadow, the darkest of the 3, with a mane that even at 5 years old had grown fuller and blacker than normal. These 3 brothers had formed a coalition, as young male lions often do when expelled from their pride. Together, they were formidable. Alone, each would struggle to survive. But as a unit, they possessed the numbers and coordination to challenge established males and take over existing territories. By early 2019, they had set their sights on the richest prize in all of Ruaha National Park, Jabari's kingdom. For weeks, the 3 brothers probed the borders of Mogusi territory. They would mark trees just outside Jabari's scent boundaries, testing his response times. They killed prey near his waterholes, drawing his attention away from the pride's central den site. They were learning his patterns, his patrol routes, the times when he was most vulnerable. Jabari knew they were there. His increased scent marking and longer patrols showed he understood the threat, but he was confident, perhaps overconfident, in his ability to defend what was his. He had driven away countless challengers before. These 3 young males, barely out of adolescence, seemed like just another test he would pass as he had passed all the others. He was wrong. What Jabari didn't know, what none of them knew, was that these three brothers had already killed before. 4 months earlier, they had successfully overthrown an older male near the Mayombe River, ending his reign in a brutal nighttime attack. They had tasted victory, and they had developed a coordinated fighting strategy that maximized their numerical advantage. By mid-March 2019, the brothers had made their decision. They would challenge Jabari directly, and they would do it soon, before the dry season reduced their strength, and before Jabari's own sons grew large enough to defend their father. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shatter one family and create an obsession that would last over 400 days. On March 17, 2019, Taka turned 32 months old. He was now a young male in the early stages of developing his adult mane, still protected by his father's dominance but old enough to understand the rhythms of pride life. That evening, he rested beside Jabari near the Madonia waterhole, their bodies touching in the cooling dusk air, watching a herd of impala drink nervously on the opposite bank. Taka had no way of knowing that this would be the last peaceful moment he would ever share with his father, that in less than 20 hours, everything he knew would end in blood and violence, that he would witness something no cub should see, and that the memory would transform him from a young lion learning to survive into something nature had never created before. A predator hunting predators, a son seeking justice, a force of vengeance that would hunt for over 400 days without rest, without mercy, without forgetting. The last sunset of the old kingdom painted the sky in shades of orange and red as Jabari's deep rumbling purr vibrated through Taka's body. Tomorrow, that sound would be silenced forever, and Taka's education would begin in the cruelest way imaginable. March 18, 2019, 6:47 a.m. The sun had just broken the horizon, painting the Magusi Plains in golden light. The morning was cooler than usual for mid-March, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of wet earth from distant storms that had passed through during the night. Jabari rose from his resting spot, shaking his magnificent mane, sending droplets of morning dew flying in crystalline arcs that caught the early light. Taka woke immediately, as he always did when his father moved. The young male stretched, his developing muscles rippling under his tawny coat. At 32 months old, he was no longer a cub, but not yet fully mature. His mane had started growing in patches around his neck and shoulders, giving him an awkward adolescent appearance that would take another year to fill out properly. The pride's lionesses were already moving, having detected a herd of zebra approximately 2 kilometers to the east, near a cluster of acacia trees. This would be a coordinated morning hunt, the kind the Mwagusi pride had perfected over years of working together. Jabari's role was clear: stay back, let the lionesses execute the kill, then assert his right to feed first when they brought down prey. But something was different this morning. Jabari's behavior carried an edge of tension that Taka had never seen before. The massive male's ears constantly swiveled, tracking sounds across the savannah. His nose worked overtime, testing every scent carried on the wind. He marked 3 different trees within 200 meters, an unusually high frequency that indicated heightened territorial anxiety. Taka stayed close to his father, mimicking his vigilance without fully understanding what was causing it. Young lions operate largely on instinct and learned behavior, and Taka's instinct told him that when Jabari was worried, he should be worried too. At 7:23 a.m., the lionesses made their move on the zebra herd. It was a textbook hunt, executed with the precision that had made this pride legendary among the rangers. 2 lionesses circled wide to the left, 2 to the right, while the remaining 2 held position as anchors. The zebras, sensing danger but unable to identify its exact location, began their nervous dance, clustering together, watching in multiple directions at once. The attack came from the north. One lioness exploded from the tall grass, separating a young male zebra from the herd. Within seconds, the others closed in, and the kill was made with efficient brutality. The entire hunt, from first charge to final breath, lasted less than 90 seconds. It was perfect, exactly the kind of success that had sustained this pride for years. Jabari began moving toward the kill site, Taka following 5 meters behind. This was the established hierarchy. The pride male feeds first, then lionesses, then cubs and young males. It was a system that had worked for millions of years of lion evolution. But today that system was about to be shattered. They came from the northwest, using the sun's position to blind anyone looking in their direction. 3 massive shapes, moving with coordinated precision that spoke of careful planning. Scar, Damu, and Kivuli had been watching the pride for hours, waiting for exactly this moment when Jabari would be separated from his lionesses, focused on feeding, vulnerable. Jabari saw them when they were still 80 meters away. His reaction was instantaneous. He roared, a sound so powerful that birds erupted from trees half a kilometer distant. It was a warning, a challenge, and a call for backup, all rolled into one deafening blast of sound. The lionesses at the kill site immediately looked up, recognizing the specific tone that meant serious danger. But they were 400 meters away. By the time they could reach Jabari, this fight would already be decided. Taka, positioned between his father and the approaching males, froze in absolute terror. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to hide, to survive, but he couldn't move. He could only watch as the three brothers spread out into an attack formation, creating a triangle that would allow them to strike from multiple angles simultaneously. Scar was in the center, the largest of the three at an estimated 450 pounds. His scarred face twisted into a snarl that revealed massive canines designed to crush bone. Damu flanked left, moving with the calculated patience of a seasoned killer. Kivuli took the right, his dark mane making him look like a shadow given substance and fury. Jabari didn't run. Kings don't run from challenges, not even when outnumbered 3-1. He positioned himself at the base of a large termite mound, using the elevated ground to partially protect his rear and flanks. It was a defensive position, the choice of a smart fighter who understood that his only chance was to make attacking him as costly as possible. Get back! Jabari's roar seemed to communicate directly to Taka, though lions don't speak in words. But the message was clear in every fiber of his being. Save yourself. This is not your fight. Taka retreated 30 meters and crouched behind a fallen log, his young body shaking uncontrollably. What happened next would burn itself into his memory with such intensity that 400 days later, every detail would remain crystal clear. The first attack came at 7:31 a.m. Scar charged directly at Jabari, a frontal assault designed to draw attention and force the defending male to commit to one direction. Jabari rose to meet him, their collision sounding like a car crash, the impact of 870 pounds of pure muscle and fury meeting head-on. But it was a feint. While Jabari's attention locked onto Scar, Damu attacked from the left, his jaws closing on Jabari's exposed hindquarters. The bite was deep, tearing through muscle and causing immediate damage to Jabari's mobility. The king roared in pain and fury, twisting to face this new threat, which left him vulnerable to Kivuli. The dark-maned male hit Jabari from the right side with devastating force, knocking him off balance on the uneven ground of the termite mound. For a critical 3 seconds, Jabari was down, his footing lost, and all three brothers were on him. What followed was 17 minutes of the most brutal combat ever documented in this region of Ruaha National Park. Jabari fought with everything he had, every ounce of experience, every technique learned from a lifetime of battles. He caught Damu with a swipe that opened a gash across the younger male's shoulder, drew blood from Kivuli's face with his claws, and even managed to lock his jaws on Scar's front leg with enough pressure to crack bone. But 3 against 1 is mathematics that even courage cannot overcome. For every wound Jabari inflicted, he received 3 in return. His magnificent mane, which had always provided protection, was being torn away in bloody chunks. Deep lacerations covered his shoulders and flanks. His breathing became labored as broken ribs made every breath agony. The lionesses arrived at 7:38 a.m., 7 minutes into the fight. But by then, Jabari was already losing. The three brothers saw the approaching females and made a calculated decision. Scar and Kivuli broke off to intercept them, leaving Damu alone with the wounded king. The lionesses faced an impossible choice. They could press forward to help Jabari, which would mean fighting 2 fresh males while potentially leaving their cubs vulnerable, or they could retreat, preserving themselves and the future of the pride's genetics. It was a choice that nature had forced on lionesses for millions of years. They retreated, and in that moment, Jabari's fate was sealed. Taka watched from his hiding spot 30 meters away as his father fought alone against Damu. The young male wanted to help, wanted to charge in with roars and fury, but he was 32 months old, barely 280 pounds, still developing. His intervention would mean 2 deaths instead of 1, and some primal survival instinct kept him frozen in place. At 7:44 a.m., Damu got the grip he had been working toward. His jaws closed around Jabari's throat, not the quick killing bite to the windpipe that ends prey animals quickly, but the crushing, suffocating hold designed to wear down an opponent through asphyxiation and blood loss. Jabari's struggles weakened, his roars became gurgles, his powerful legs, which had carried him across thousands of kilometers of territory, began to tremble and fail. And still Damu held on, his jaws locked with 650 psi of pressure, slowly, methodically ending the reign of the Magusi king. By 7:48 a.m., Jabari had stopped moving. The male who had ruled this territory for 6 years, who had sired 14 cubs, who had defended these waterholes and plains and trees with his blood and strength, lay dead on the side of a termite mound, his body torn and broken, his magnificent mane soaked in his own blood. Scar and Kivuli returned from chasing off the lionesses. The three brothers stood over Jabari's corpse, roaring their victory to the sky. It was the ancient proclamation of regime change, the announcement that new kings had arrived and the old order was dead. And then they did something that Taka would never forget, something that transformed this from a tragic but natural changing of power into something far more personal. They fed on Jabari's body. Lions feeding on other lions is extraordinarily rare, documented only a handful of times in scientific literature. It's not about nutrition. There were zebra carcasses available nearby. It's about complete domination, the ultimate assertion of superiority. It's about erasing the previous male so thoroughly that not even his physical form remains to challenge the new order. Taka watched from his hiding spot as these three males, these killers, consumed his father. He watched as they tore flesh from bone, as they fought over organs, as they reduced the lion who had been his entire world into nothing more than a meal. The psychological impact of this scene on a young male lion cannot be overstated. Something broke inside Taka in those moments, but something else was born, something cold and calculating and utterly focused. As he watched his father being devoured, his young mind was recording every detail of the three males, the scar across Scar's eye, the blood-stained chest of Damu, the darkness of Kivuli's mane, the way they moved, the sounds they made, the hierarchy between them, with Scar clearly dominant. By 8:30 a.m., the three brothers had finished their grotesque meal and moved toward the pride's main den area, where Jabari's lionesses waited with cubs. This too was part of the terrible script that nature had written. The new males would kill all of Jabari's young cubs, forcing the lionesses into estrus and ensuring that only the victor's genes would continue. But Taka was old enough, just barely old enough, to be spared from infanticide. At 32 months, he was no longer a cub but a young male who could potentially leave the territory and survive on his own. The three brothers would likely tolerate his presence for a short time before eventually driving him away, as long as he showed submission and accepted their dominance. They expected him to follow the ancient pattern, submit, leave, find other young males, form a coalition, and someday challenge for his own territory far from here. That's what nature had programmed into lion behavior over millions of years of evolution. But Taka was not going to follow that pattern. As he watched the three killers disappear toward his pride's den site, as he turned back to look at what remained of his father's body being picked over by early arriving vultures, something unprecedented occurred in his young mind. He was not going to submit, he was not going to leave, and he was not going to forget. For the next 3 hours, Taka remained near his father's body, hidden in the thorny scrub, watching as scavengers reduced the great Jabari to scattered bones. Hyenas arrived, their laughing calls echoing across the savannah. Vultures descended in a black cloud. Jackals darted in and out, stealing what they could. By noon, there was almost nothing left of Jabari except blood-stained earth and bone fragments. The king of Mawagusi had been erased from the physical world in less than 6 hours, but he had not been erased from his son's memory. That memory would prove to be more dangerous than any physical presence could have been. At 2:15 p.m., Taka finally rose from his hiding spot. His body was stiff from remaining motionless for so long. His throat was dry from hours without water. His stomach was empty of food, but none of that mattered compared to the clarity that had formed in his mind during those long hours of witnessing his father's complete destruction. He began walking, not away from the territory as nature intended, but in a wide circle around the pride's new rulers. He moved silently through the thorny scrub, using techniques his father had taught him. He drank from a small, isolated water source, far from the main holes where the three brothers would be establishing their dominance. He killed a young warthog that evening, eating quickly and efficiently, driven by necessity rather than hunger, and he watched, from the shadows, from the concealment of dense vegetation, from the elevated vantage points his smaller size allowed him to access. Taka watched. He observed as Scar, Damu and Kivuli integrated themselves into his former pride. He saw them mate with lionesses who had been his father's partners. He witnessed them mark territory that had been Jabari's. Most painfully, he watched from a distance as the three brothers killed two of his younger half-siblings, cubs too young to be spared. Their tiny bodies were shaken like toys before being discarded, more family erased, more reasons added to the accounting that was forming in Taka's mind. The Rangers noticed him during this period. Joseph Mwenda recorded in his field journal on March 23rd, 5 days after Jabari's death, observed young male, approximately 2.5 years old, remaining on territory despite takeover by coalition of three. Unusual behavior. Typical response would be immediate departure. This male is staying close but avoiding direct contact. Monitoring situation. What Joseph and the other researchers didn't understand yet was that Taka wasn't simply lingering out of confusion or attachment to familiar territory. He was learning, studying, preparing. Every day he memorized more about his father's killers, their preferred resting spots, their patrol patterns, the times they drank, the hierarchy of their feeding order, the dynamics of their relationships with each other. He learned that Scar was the undisputed leader, dominant in all interactions, that Damu was aggressive and hot-tempered, quick to start fights even within the coalition, that Kivuli was the most cautious, always scanning for threats, the strategist of the group. He learned which of them were injured from the fight with Jabari, and which had escaped mostly unscathed. He noted that Scar had a slight limp on his left front paw, that Damu's shoulder wound was healing slowly, that Kivuli seemed to tire more easily than the others. This was information, intelligence gathering, the kind of detailed observation that prey animals use to avoid predators. Except Taka was not prey. He was something that nature had never intended to create. A young male lion learning to think of older, stronger males not as superiors to submit to, but as targets to eventually destroy. By early April, 3 weeks after his father's death, Taka had been forced to expand his range. The three brothers were becoming less tolerant of his presence, charging him whenever they spotted him, though never quite catching him as he fled into territories they weren't yet ready to claim. He established a marginal existence in the borderlands between established territories, surviving on smaller prey and staying constantly alert. But he never stopped watching Mwagusi. Every few days, he would return to the edges of what had been his father's kingdom. He would observe the three brothers from safe distances, and he would add to his mental catalogue of information about them. The Rangers began to notice something else during this period. Taka was growing, and he was growing fast. The stress of survival, the constant movement, the need to hunt alone, all of this was forging his body and mind in ways that comfortable pride life never could have. By May 2019, just 2 months after his father's death, Taka had put on an estimated 40 pounds of muscle. But more significantly, his behavior was changing in ways that suggested unusual cognitive development. Dr. Sarah Chen, a wildlife behaviorist who had been studying the Ruaha lions for 5 years, noted, "This young male is exhibiting patterns of delayed gratification and long-term planning that are exceptional even for lions, which are already among the most intelligent of the big cats. He's avoiding direct confrontations that he cannot win while systematically gathering information. It's almost as if he's preparing for something." She was right. Taka was preparing. For 400 days, he would prepare, learning to survive alone, growing stronger, studying his enemies, and waiting for the moment when the balance of power would shift enough for him to do what seemed impossible: hunt down his father's killers, one by one, and make them pay for what they had taken from him. But first, he had to survive, and survival in the African wilderness, for a lone young male lion without a pride or coalition, is one of the hardest challenges nature can present. The education that began with his father's murder was about to continue in ways that would transform Taka from a lion into something far more dangerous: a weapon with patience, a predator with purpose, a son with an unbreakable memory, and 400 days of rage to sustain him. April 2019 through September 2019, 5 months that would transform Taka from a displaced young male into something the African wilderness had never seen before. These weren't months of aimless wandering or simple survival. Every day was a lesson. Every challenge was training. Every moment was preparation for what he had decided. With absolute certainty, he would eventually do. The borderlands where Taka established his temporary existence were unforgiving. These were the margins between established territories, the no-man's lands where prey was scarce and competition was fierce. Hyena clans moved through regularly, their numbers making them dangerous even to a young male lion. Leopards controlled the rocky outcrops and dense vegetation. Wild dogs hunted in coordinated packs that could bring down prey far larger than themselves. For a lion accustomed to pride life, where lionesses did most of the hunting and the pride male's size guaranteed first access to kills, this was a brutal awakening. Taka had to learn skills that most male lions never fully develop: solo hunting, stealth, patience, and the ability to survive on prey much smaller than what his father's pride had enjoyed. His first solo kill came on April 3, 2019, 16 days after his father's death. A young impala, approximately 45 kilograms, separated from its herd during the late afternoon when animals are drowsy and less vigilant. Taka had been tracking this particular herd for 2 days, learning their patterns, identifying the individuals most likely to make mistakes. The hunt was clumsy. He revealed himself too early, his inexperience showing in every movement. The impala nearly escaped, but Taka's desperation gave him speed he didn't know he possessed. The chase covered 400 meters before he finally brought the prey down, exhausted and trembling, his jaws finding the throat after 3 failed attempts. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't efficient, but it was his. That night, as he fed alone under a rising moon, something shifted in Taka's understanding. He could survive, not comfortably, not easily, but he could do it, and survival was the foundation everything else would be built upon. By May, his hunting success rate had improved dramatically. Where it took the average young male lion 6 months to become proficient at solo hunting, Taka achieved it in 2. His motivation was different from other young males who hunted out of necessity. Taka hunted with purpose. Every successful kill meant another day he could continue watching, learning, preparing. He developed techniques unusual for lions. While most relied on power and short burst speed, Taka learned patience from observing leopards. He would wait for hours, absolutely motionless, for prey to come within striking distance. He learned to hunt at unusual times, during the middle of the day when other predators rested, or in the deepest part of night when even lions typically slept. Joseph Mwenda's field notes from June 14, 2019. Young males spotted with warthog kill at 2:30 p.m., highly unusual hunting time. The kill was made in full daylight, suggesting either desperation or tactical innovation. Given this individual's consistent weight gain and apparent health, I'm inclined toward the latter. He's adapting in ways I've never observed. But Taka wasn't just learning to hunt. He was learning to be invisible. Lions are not naturally stealthy animals. Their social structure and size mean they typically don't need to hide. But Taka studied the leopards that shared his borderland territory. He watched how they moved through tall grass without creating visible disturbance, how they used shadows and terrain features to approach prey undetected, how they could observe without being observed. He applied these lessons to something far more dangerous than hunting prey. Every week, sometimes twice a week, Taka would return to the edges of the Magusi territory. He would position himself downwind, using natural cover, and watch the 3 brothers, sometimes for hours, sometimes for entire days. He memorized everything. Scar's limp had healed, but the coalition leader had developed a habit of favoring his right side when rising from rest, a potential weakness. Damu's shoulder wound had left a permanent scar and reduced flexibility in that limb, another weakness. Kavuli had developed a respiratory issue, a slight wheeze audible at close range, that suggested some internal injury from the battle with Jabari might not have healed properly. These were details most observers would miss, but Taka was no longer just observing. He was conducting reconnaissance, building a mental database that would one day mean the difference between revenge and death. Dr. Sarah Chen began tracking Taka specifically in July 2019, recognizing that his behavior was scientifically significant. She set up remote camera traps along his known routes and spent weeks in the field documenting his movements. What she discovered challenged fundamental assumptions about lion cognition. This male is engaging in what can only be described as strategic planning over extended time horizons. She wrote in her preliminary research notes. He's not merely surviving day to day. His behavioral patterns suggest goal-oriented activity focused on a specific territory and specific individuals. The level of sustained attention and apparent memory retention is unprecedented in my field experience. By August 2019, 5 months after his father's death, Tucker had grown into a formidable young male. He now weighed approximately 380 pounds, his mane filling out across his neck and shoulders in dark, thick waves that would have made Jabari proud. His body was leaner than a pride male's would be. The constant movement and hunting meant less body fat, but the muscle definition was exceptional. More importantly, his skills had sharpened to a level that shocked the rangers who tracked him. On August 19th, tour guide Peter Mollel witnessed something that would become legendary among the Ruaha Park staff. Tucker successfully brought down a young buffalo calf, approximately 200 kilograms, completely alone. Buffalo are among the most dangerous prey animals in Africa. Even pride-living lions often refuse to hunt them due to the risk of injury. A single buffalo can kill a lion with its horns, and the herd will defend their young with suicidal aggression. For a lone young male to target a buffalo calf and succeed was virtually unheard of. I've been guiding in Ruaha for 11 years, Peter later reported. I've never seen a solo male that young even attempt to hunt buffalo, let alone succeed. The technique was flawless. He separated the calf from the herd using a rocky outcrop, prevented the mother from intervening with aggressive charges, and made the kill before the herd could organize a counterattack. This wasn't luck, this was expertise. But perhaps the most significant development during these months was something that happened inside Tucker's mind. The initial white-hot rage that had consumed him in the days after his father's death had transformed into something colder, more focused, and far more dangerous: patience. Young male lions are not patient creatures by nature. They're driven by testosterone, impulsive, prone to challenging rivals they cannot defeat. Tucker had somehow bypassed this programming. When other young males his age were forming coalitions and making foolish challenges for territories, Tucker waited, watched, learned. September 2019 brought the beginning of the dry season, when water sources shrink and prey concentrations increase around the few remaining waterholes. It was during this period that Tucker made a crucial observation that would eventually enable everything that followed. The three brothers were not as united as they appeared. Cracks were forming in their coalition. Scar's dominance was absolute, but it came at the cost of increasingly aggressive interactions with Damu, who was approaching his prime at 6 years old and beginning to question the hierarchy. Kivuli remained loyal to Scar, creating a 2-against-1 dynamic that left Damu isolated and resentful. Tucker watched a confrontation on September 7th that confirmed what he had begun to suspect. Damu had made a kill, a zebra, and Scar arrived to claim priority feeding rights. Damu, for the first time, refused to submit immediately. The two males circled each other for nearly 10 minutes, roaring challenges, before Damu finally backed down. But the defiance had been there. The coalition was not as solid as it needed to be for long-term stability. And in that weakness, Tucker saw opportunity. By October 2019, 7 months after his father's death, Tucker had achieved something remarkable. He had survived alone longer than most young male lions manage, and he had continued to grow stronger rather than weaker. Park rangers estimated his weight at 400 pounds, with a mane that marked him as undeniably adult despite his young age of 35 months. But more significantly, he had become something unique in the park's ecosystem. The guides began calling him Kivuli wa Kivuli, Shadow of Shadows, because of his ability to appear and disappear without warning, to observe without being observed, to exist in the margins like a ghost. Dr. Chen's research was beginning to attract attention from the wider scientific community. She had documented over 40 instances of Tucker engaging in what could only be called surveillance behavior, targeting the three brothers. She had evidence of his extraordinary hunting proficiency and survival skills, but most intriguingly, she had begun to notice patterns in his movements that suggested something almost impossible to accept. "If I didn't know better," she confided to Joseph Mwenda in late October, "I would say this male is preparing for a coordinated campaign against specific targets. His behavior resembles nothing so much as a predator, learning the habits of dangerous prey before attempting a hunt. But the targets are 3 adult male lions in their prime, which should be impossible for a single young male to challenge successfully." Joseph, who had been watching Taka longer than anyone, nodded slowly. "I've seen something in his eyes when he watches those three," he said quietly. "It's not fear, it's not submission. I've been observing lions for 23 years, and I've never seen that expression before. If I had to name it, I would call it resolve." November 2019 marked the beginning of the wet season, when prey disperses across the now greening landscape and territories become harder to defend due to the vast spaces involved. It was during this month that Taka made his first direct contact with one of his father's killers since the takeover. It happened at a waterhole called Madonia Minor, a small pool fed by seasonal runoff, located at the far edge of what had once been Jabari's territory. Taka had claimed this marginal area as his own, knowing the three brothers rarely patrolled this far from their central den site. But on November 12th, Kivuli appeared, likely following a herd of impala. Taka was drinking when he caught Kivuli's scent on the wind. Every instinct told him to run, to avoid confrontation, to preserve himself for a future he had planned. But something else stirred in his chest, a need to test himself, to see if the ghost could stand before one of the demons from his nightmares. He didn't flee. Instead, he moved to elevated ground and waited. When Kivuli arrived at the waterhole and lowered his head to drink, Taka released a roar, not a challenge roar. He wasn't ready for that yet, but a territorial announcement, a message that said, "I am here. I have not left. I will not submit." Kivuli's head snapped up, water dripping from his muzzle. His eyes found Taka on the ridge 50 meters away. For a long moment, the two males stared at each other. Kivuli, at 7 years old and 430 pounds, was significantly larger. He was battle-tested, pride-dominant, secure in his power. But something in Taka's posture gave him pause. The young male didn't look like prey. He didn't look like a subordinate ready to flee. He looked like a lion who had decided to stand his ground. And Kivuli's experience told him that sometimes standing your ground means you're willing to die for it. The standoff lasted 3 minutes before Kivuli made his decision. He roared back, a challenge that said, "Leave now or fight." Then he charged. Taka ran, but not in blind panic. He retreated in a controlled manner, using terrain he knew intimately, leading Kivuli through dense thorn scrub that tangled the larger male's mane and slowed his pursuit. After 200 meters, Kivuli gave up the chase, roaring his displeasure but unwilling to waste energy on an extended pursuit of a young male who was leaving anyway. But here's what Kivuli didn't understand. Taka hadn't fled in fear. He had withdrawn tactically after achieving his objective. He had tested his nerve. He had proven to himself that he could stand before one of his father's killers without freezing in terror, and he had learned something valuable. Kivuli would chase initially, but lacked the persistence for extended pursuits. Likely due to that respiratory issue Taka had identified months earlier. Information. Always information. Every interaction was a data point in the campaign Taka was building. December 2019 brought a significant change to the dynamic in Magusi territory. Damu, increasingly aggressive in his challenges to Scar's dominance, made a critical error. He attempted to mate with one of the Pride's senior lionesses without Scar's permission. The confrontation that followed was brief but violent. Scar inflicted serious wounds on Damu, re-establishing the hierarchy through blood and pain, but instead of submitting fully, Damu began spending more time away from the Pride's core territory, essentially living on the margins of the coalition's range. He was still technically part of the group, but the bond was fraying. Taka observed this development with intense interest. A coalition of 3 was formidable, a coalition of 2 was manageable, and a coalition of isolated individuals was vulnerable. The cracks he had identified in September had become fractures by December. By January 2020, 10 months after his father's death, Taka had established himself as a presence the 3 brothers could no longer ignore. He was regularly seen on the edges of Magusi territory. His roars could be heard at night, always from the periphery, never quite close enough to force a confrontation, but constant enough to be a psychological presence. Dr. Chen noted, "The young male has begun what appears to be systematic psychological pressure on the coalition. He's not yet strong enough for direct combat, but he's using territorial displays to create constant low-level stress. It's a tactic I've never seen documented in lions, using presence and sound to wear down rivals rather than engaging directly." What she was witnessing was warfare of a kind that lions typically don't engage in. Direct combat, yes. Territorial battles, absolutely. But this sustained campaign of psychological pressure over months, combined with strategic patience, was unprecedented. February and March 2020 saw Taka continuing to grow and refine his skills. At 38 months old, he was now a fully mature male, weighing an estimated 420 pounds. His mane had developed into a magnificent dark cascade that covered his neck and shoulders, making him look larger and more intimidating than his actual size. More importantly, he was at the peak of his physical condition, lean, fast, powerful, and driven by a purpose that gave him an edge no normal lion possessed. By late March 2020, exactly 1 year after his father's death, Taka had achieved something remarkable. He had survived alone longer than 85% of young male lions manage. He had developed hunting skills that rivaled those of prime pride males. He had mapped every detail of his enemy's territory, habits, and weaknesses, and he had transformed his initial rage into something far more dangerous, a cold, patient determination to see justice done. The Rangers marked the anniversary of Jabari's death with quiet reflection. Joseph Mwenda placed a small cairn of stones near where the great male had fallen, a human gesture of respect for a lion who had been special. As he built this memorial, he noticed something in the distance. Taka, standing on a ridge overlooking the Magusi territory. Watching, always watching. He hasn't forgotten, Joseph said quietly to Dr. Chen, who had joined him. Whatever that young male is planning, it's not finished, not even close. Dr. Chen adjusted her camera, capturing images of Taka's silhouette against the setting sun. The question is, she replied, what happens when he decides he's ready? Can a lone male actually challenge 3 coalition members? Everything in lion behavioral science says it's impossible. Joseph watched Taka for a long moment before responding. Maybe, but everything in lion behavioral science also says a young male shouldn't be able to survive alone this long, shouldn't be able to develop the skills he's developed, and shouldn't be able to maintain focus on a specific goal for over a year. This lion has already done the impossible. Why would he stop now? The answer to that question would come in the months ahead, as Taka's long preparation finally reached its culmination. The ghost was about to become a hunter, and the killers who had destroyed his father were about to learn that some debts, even in the animal kingdom, must eventually be paid. But first, the coalition itself would provide the opening Taka had been waiting for. Because in nature, as in war, the greatest vulnerabilities often come from within. And Damu's growing resentment of Scar's dominance was about to explode into violence that would reshape the entire landscape of power in Magusi. April 2020, 13 months after Jabari's death, would mark the beginning of the end for his killers. The 400-day hunt was approaching its final bloody phase, and Taka, the son who refused to forget, was finally ready to move from observer to executioner. April 17, 2020, 13 months and 30 days since Jabari's death. The dry season had returned to Ruaha with punishing intensity, transforming the landscape into a harsh testing ground where only the strongest survived. Waterholes that had been abundant during the wet months now shrank to muddy pools surrounded by cracked earth. Prey animals clustered around these dwindling resources, and predators followed. The Magusi territory, once the richest land in the region, was showing signs of strain under the leadership of the 3 brothers. Their coalition, never as cohesive as Jabari's carefully maintained pride, was fracturing under the pressure of drought and internal conflict. What Taka had observed developing over months was now reaching its breaking point. Damu had effectively separated from the coalition. He still occasionally crossed paths with Scar and Kivali, but he hunted alone, marked his own territory on the eastern edge of Magusi, and answered to no one. At 6 years old and in his prime, he was powerful enough to survive independently, but isolation made him vulnerable in ways he didn't fully appreciate. Taka had been watching this separation with the focused attention of a predator identifying wounded prey. For over a year, he had prepared for this moment. Now finally, the opportunity he needed had presented itself. The 3-headed monster that had killed his father had lost one of its heads, and that isolated head would be the first to fall. Dr. Sarah Chen's field notes from April 18, 2020. The young male we've been tracking has changed his behavioral patterns significantly over the past week. He's no longer maintaining his usual distance from the former coalition members. He's moved closer to the Eastern Territory, specifically the area now controlled by the individual we call Damu. His movements suggest purpose rather than random wandering. I have a deeply unsettling feeling about what may be about to unfold. She was right to be unsettled, because on April 20th, 2020, at approximately 4:30 in the afternoon, Taka made his move. Damu had made a kill that morning, a young wildebeest, approximately 180 kilograms, and had gorged himself on meat before retreating to shade for the afternoon rest that all lions need after feeding. He chose a cluster of acacia trees near a dried riverbed, a spot he had used regularly over the past weeks. Routine is comfort for territorial animals, but routine is also predictability, and predictability is vulnerability. Taka had been tracking Damu for 3 days, mapping his patrol routes, identifying his preferred resting spots, noting the times when he was most vulnerable. The young male had learned patience from 13 months of preparation. He didn't rush. He waited for the perfect convergence of circumstances. That convergence came at 4:47 p.m. on April 20th. Damu was deep in post-feeding sleep, his belly distended, his body in the temporary vulnerability that comes after a large meal. The afternoon heat was at its peak, making all animals sluggish and less alert. And most critically, Damu was completely alone, over 3 kilometers from where Scar and Kavuli were resting with the pride. Taka approached from downwind, moving with the silence he had learned from watching leopards. Every step was calculated, every movement was controlled. At 40 meters out, he paused behind a termite mound, studying his target. Damu's breathing was deep and regular, the sleep of an apex predator who feared nothing in his domain. That would be his final mistake. At 4:52 p.m., Taka charged. He covered the 40 meters in approximately 4.5 seconds, his 420 pounds moving with explosive speed that gave Damu almost no time to react. The first impact was devastating. Taka hit the older male's side with the full force of his momentum, bowling him over before he could fully wake. But Damu was a battle-tested fighter who had helped kill Jabari. His reflexes, even dulled by sleep and a full stomach, were formidable. He twisted beneath Taka, his claws finding purchase, his jaws snapping toward the younger male's throat. For a critical 3 seconds, they were a tangle of teeth and claws and fury, dust exploding around them. Taka was younger, faster, and driven by 13 months of focused rage, but Damu was heavier by 30 pounds and had years more combat experience. Under normal circumstances, this fight should have been close, but ultimately in Damu's favor. But these weren't normal circumstances. Taka had been preparing for this exact confrontation for over a year. He knew Damu's injured shoulder from the fight with Jabari had reduced flexibility on that side. He knew the older male's tendency to go for high throat bites rather than suffocating jaw locks. He knew every possible advantage and weakness, and he exploited all of them with surgical precision. When Damu attempted his signature move, a high lunge toward the throat, Taka dropped low, using the technique he had observed leopards employ against larger opponents. The miss left Damu momentarily off balance, and Taka struck at the weak shoulder, his claws tearing through the old scar tissue and reopening wounds that had never properly healed. Damu roared in pain and rage, the sound echoing across the dry savanna. In the distance, approximately 3 kilometers away, Scar's head snapped up at the sound. He recognized his coalition partner's voice, recognized the tone of serious combat. But 3 kilometers in the afternoon heat, for a 7-year-old male after a recent large meal, might as well have been 30 kilometers. By the time help could arrive, this fight would be decided. Taka pressed his advantage with relentless aggression. This wasn't the careful, measured combat of males testing each other's strength. This was execution. Every move Taka made had a purpose: destabilize, injure, weaken, kill. He had spent 13 months preparing for this, and he wasn't going to allow doubt or mercy to interfere. At 4:57 p.m., 5 minutes into the fight, Taka achieved the position he needed. His jaws closed around Damu's throat, not the quick windpipe crush, but the suffocating hold that slowly drains life through pressure and terror. Damu thrashed desperately, his strength still formidable, his claws raking deep furrows across Taka's shoulders and flanks. But Taka held on. Through the pain, through the exhaustion, through everything, he held on. Because releasing meant failure, and failure meant dishonoring his father's memory. His jaws, strengthened by 13 months of solo hunting and survival, maintained their grip with 600 psi of crushing pressure. Damu's struggles began to weaken at 5:03 p.m. His roars became gurgles. His powerful legs, which had helped bring down Jabari 13 months earlier, began to tremble and fail. And still Taka held on, his amber eyes locked on his enemy's face, watching the life drain away. At 5:09 p.m., Damu stopped moving. The male who had fed on Jabari's body, who had helped destroy Taka's family, lay dead in the dust of the same territory he had stolen. 17 minutes from first contact to death, Taka had achieved what every instinct said was impossible. A lone young male had killed a prime coalition member in direct combat. But there was no time for celebration or reflection. Taka could hear roars in the distance, Scar and Kavuli responding to Damu's distress calls, racing toward this location. He had perhaps 10 minutes before they arrived, and facing two coalition members simultaneously would be suicide even for a lion as prepared as Taka. He did something then that shocked Dr. Chen when she later reviewed the camera trap footage from the area. Before fleeing, Taka did to Damu's body what the three brothers had done to Jabari. He fed, not from hunger. He had killed a warthog just 8 hours earlier, but from the same impulse that had driven the brothers 13 months ago, complete domination, utter erasure, the assertion that the defeated had been reduced to nothing more than meat. It was justice, brutal, primal, absolute justice. And it took less than 2 minutes before Taka heard the approaching roars growing dangerously close. He melted into the thorny scrub, using the same ghost-like movement that had kept him alive for 13 months, disappearing before Scar and Kivali arrived to find their coalition partner's body. The roars that echoed across Magusi that evening were unlike anything the Rangers had heard before. Scar and Kivali stood over Damu's corpse, their fury and confusion evident in every thunderous vocalization. This wasn't supposed to happen. Coalition members didn't die like this, killed by lone males barely out of adolescence. But the evidence was undeniable. The bite marks on Damu's throat were too small to be from another coalition-sized male. The tracks in the dust told a story of a smaller, lighter attacker, and the partial feeding on the body carried a message that any lion could understand. This was personal. Joseph Mwenda, responding to reports of unusual lion activity, arrived at the scene at 6:30 p.m., just as Scar and Kivali were finally leaving Damu's body. What he found shocked him to his core. "I've been studying these animals for over 2 decades, he later reported. "I've seen territorial battles, coalition warfare, infanticide, all the brutality that lion society involves, but this was different. The precision of the attack, the efficiency of the kill, the symbolic feeding, this wasn't random violence. This was calculated revenge, and I knew immediately who was responsible." Dr. Chen arrived the following morning to document the scene. Her preliminary analysis confirmed what Joseph suspected. "The kill techniques show elements unusual for lions of this age," she noted. "The attacker used vulnerabilities from old injuries, suggesting long-term observation and strategic planning, combined with the timing, isolating one coalition member when others were distant. This represents a level of tactical sophistication that challenges our understanding of lion cognition." What neither of them knew yet was that this was just the beginning. Because Taka's campaign wasn't complete, 2 of his father's killers still lived, and the ghost had learned that the impossible was achievable if you were willing to wait, to plan and to strike when the moment was perfect. The death of Damu sent shockwaves through the established order of Mwagusi territory. Scar and Kivuli, who had ruled with absolute confidence for 13 months, suddenly faced an enemy they couldn't identify or anticipate. The psychological impact was devastating. Lions are creatures of routine and territorial confidence. They mark their boundaries, roar their dominance, and expect submission from all lesser males. But now there was a killer in their territory who didn't submit, who didn't flee, who struck when they were vulnerable and disappeared before they could retaliate. Over the following weeks, both remaining coalition members became noticeably more cautious. They patrolled together constantly, refusing to separate even for hunting. They slept less, alert to every sound and movement. Their roaring increased in frequency, a constant assertion of dominance meant to intimidate the unseen threat. But fear, once introduced into a coalition, is like poison. It spreads, it creates paranoia, and paranoia creates mistakes. Taka, meanwhile, had returned to his borderland territory to heal from the wounds Damu had inflicted. Deep claw marks across his shoulders and flanks required rest and recovery. But even while healing, he never stopped watching. Camera traps set up by Dr. Chen's team captured him observing Scar and Kivali from distant vantage points, his tactical intelligence gathering continuing even as his body recovered. May and June 2020 saw an interesting development. With Damu dead and the remaining brothers constantly together, Taka couldn't find an opening for a second attack. But he didn't need to actively hunt them to cause damage. His mere presence, the knowledge that somewhere in the shadows a killer waited, was eroding the coalition from within. Scar became increasingly aggressive, even toward Kivuli, lashing out in stress-driven rages when hunts failed, or when he caught unfamiliar scents on territorial boundaries. Kivuli, never as dominant or confident as his coalition partner, grew more nervous and hesitant. The unity that had made them strong enough to kill Jabari was disintegrating under psychological pressure. Dr. Chen documented this deterioration in her research notes. The remaining coalition members are exhibiting signs of chronic stress, reduced hunting success, increased aggression toward each other, disrupted sleep patterns. The presence of the young male, even without direct contact, is having measurable psychological effects. This suggests lions may have far more complex emotional responses to perceived threats than previously understood. July 2020 brought the moment Taka had been waiting for. Scar and Kivuli had a territorial confrontation with a neighboring pride's males, a fight that left both of them injured and exhausted. Nothing life-threatening, but enough to slow them down, reduce their vigilance, create vulnerability. Taka observed this battle from a hidden position 600 meters away. He watched as Scar took a horn wound to his left flank from a buffalo the brothers had attempted to bring down 2 days after the territorial fight. He noted Kivuli's worsening respiratory condition, the wheeze now audible even at 20 meters distance. They were weakening. The stress, the injuries, the constant vigilance, it was taking its toll. And Taka, who had been waiting with inhuman patience for 16 months, recognized that his second opportunity was approaching. On July 23, 2020, exactly 16 months and 5 days after his father's death, Taka struck again. The circumstances were different this time. He didn't attack in daylight. He didn't engage in the direct, explosive combat that had characterized his fight with Damu. Instead, he used the darkness, the terrain, and his enemy's exhaustion to maximum advantage. Kivuli had separated from Scar to investigate a herd of zebra moving through the northern section of their territory. It wasn't a long separation, maybe 400 meters, but it was enough. The coalition brothers were being more careful than they had been, but constant vigilance over months is exhausting, and even the most alert predator eventually makes mistakes. Taka had been shadowing them for 3 days, waiting for exactly this moment. When Kivuli moved into a rocky area with limited visibility, dense scrub, and uneven footing, Taka made his approach. But this time, he didn't charge immediately. He waited until Kivuli was navigating through a narrow passage between 2 large boulders, a space that limited the larger male's ability to maneuver. The attack came at 9:47 p.m., in near complete darkness except for a half moon. Taka struck from above, having positioned himself on one of the boulders, using gravity and surprise to maximum effect. The impact drove Kivuli into the ground, and before the older male could recover, Taka's jaws found his throat. But Kivuli was not as weakened as Damu had been. Despite his respiratory issues, despite his exhaustion, he fought back with desperate strength. The battle that followed was vicious and prolonged, both males knowing that only one would walk away. In the darkness, it was impossible for either to see clearly, making every move a gamble, every bite and claw strike guided by feel and instinct. Approximately 400 meters away, Scar heard the sounds of combat and rushed toward them. But the rocky terrain that Taka had chosen specifically for this encounter slowed the coalition leader's approach. By the time Scar navigated through the boulder field, arriving at 10:03 p.m., the fight was over. Kivuli lay dead, his throat crushed, his body bearing the marks of a fighter who had given everything in those final minutes. And Taka was gone, disappeared into the night like the ghost the Rangers had named him. Scar stood over his last coalition partner's body, roaring into the darkness with a mixture of rage, grief, and something that no one would have expected to hear from a lion: fear. He was alone now. The coalition of 3 that had seemed invincible 16 months ago had been reduced to 1, and somewhere in the shadows, the hunter who had destroyed his brothers was still out there. For the first time since the takeover, Scar retreated from Mwagusi territory. Not permanently, not in full surrender, but he abandoned the prime central area and moved to the western edges, closer to where other established males might provide some psychological buffer against the unseen threat. The rangers and researchers tracking this unprecedented situation were stunned by what they were witnessing. Joseph Mwenda's field report from July 25, 2020, the dominant male of the coalition that overthrew Jabari, has effectively been driven from the territory by a lone young male through a campaign of targeted eliminations. This reversal of the natural order is without precedent in my experience. The psychological warfare aspects suggest cognitive abilities in lions that challenge everything we thought we understood. Dr. Chen was even more direct in her analysis. We are watching something that shouldn't be possible. A lone male, using intelligence, patience, and strategic planning over an extended time period, has systematically destroyed a coalition. This isn't just unusual lion behavior. This is evidence of complex cognition that approaches what we typically consider human-level strategic thinking. But Taka's campaign wasn't finished. 2 of his father's killers were dead, but 1 remained. Scar, the largest, the most dominant, the one who had delivered the killing blow to Jabari, still lived, and until Scar was dead, Taka's mission would remain incomplete. August through November 2020, 4 months during which Scar existed in a state of constant vigilance that no lion was designed to sustain. He had retreated to marginal territory, abandoned the pride he had taken from Jabari, and essentially lived as a lone male despite being in his prime at 7 years old. The psychological toll was evident to anyone who observed him. His once magnificent mane was ragged and patchy from stress. He had lost significant weight, his ribs showing through his coat. His roars, once confident assertions of dominance, now carried an edge of desperation. Taka, meanwhile, had done something unexpected. He had moved into the central Magusi territory, the heart of what had been his father's kingdom. The lionesses, recognizing his dominance through his defeats of the coalition members, gradually accepted him. He began marking the same trees Jabari had marked. He patrolled the same boundaries his father had defended. In essence, Taka had reclaimed his birthright, but the reclamation wouldn't be complete until the last of his father's killers was dead. Dr. Chen documented this period extensively. The young male has achieved something unprecedented. He has essentially won back his father's territory through a campaign that combined violence, intelligence, and psychological warfare. But his behavior suggests the mission is not complete. He continues to search for the last coalition member, spending hours each day tracking and observing. The final confrontation came on December 2nd, 2020, exactly 624 days after Jabari's death. 20 months and 14 days of patience, planning, and relentless pursuit finally reached their culmination at the same location where it had all begun. The termite mound near Madonia Waterhole. Scar had returned to Mawagusi, driven by the same forces that make lions who they are, the need for territory, for pride, for the status that defines male lion existence. He couldn't survive as a marginal lone male forever. Eventually, he had to reclaim what he had lost, or die trying. He arrived at the waterhole at 3:30 p.m., moving cautiously, scanning constantly for threats. But Taka had been waiting for 3 days, positioned in the exact spot where he had hidden 20 months earlier as a terrified young male watching his father die. The symmetry was not lost on the researchers who would later piece together the timeline. This time, Taka wasn't hiding in fear. He was waiting in ambush. The attack came at 3:47 p.m. as Scar lowered his head to drink. Taka charged from the concealment of dense scrub, covering 50 meters in just over 5 seconds, hitting Scar with the full force of his now 440-pound body. But Scar was not Damu or Kivuli. He was the coalition leader, the largest and most experienced fighter, the one who had actually killed Jabari. At 460 pounds, and with years of battle experience, he was a formidable opponent even in his weakened state. What followed was the longest and most brutal of Taka's 3 revenge killings. The fight lasted 43 minutes, both males pouring every ounce of strength, skill, and will into the combat. They rolled down the side of the termite mound, through thorny scrub, across rocks that opened wounds on both their bodies. Scar fought with the desperation of a male who knew this was his final stand. Taka fought with 20 months of focused rage, finally unleashed. The sounds of their battle echoed across Mawagusi, drawing the attention of the entire ecosystem. Hyenas gathered at a respectful distance. Vultures circled overhead. The lionesses of the pride watched from 200 meters away, their future resting on the outcome of this fight. At 4:19 p.m., Taka achieved a grip on Scar's throat, but the older male twisted with desperate strength, breaking free and counter-attacking with a fury that opened deep wounds across Taka's face and neck. Blood poured from both males, staining the earth around them. They separated for a moment, both breathing heavily, both bleeding from multiple wounds, both understanding that the next engagement would likely be the last. And in that moment of pause, something remarkable happened. Tucker roared, not a challenge roar or a territorial announcement. This was different. This was a sound that carried within it 20 months of memory, of loss, of grief transformed into purpose. And in that roar, anyone listening could hear the ghost of Jabari, the echo of a father in his son's voice. Scar's response was weak, exhausted, the roar of a male who had already lost but refused to accept it. And when they collided for the final time at 4:23 p.m., the outcome was inevitable. Tucker's jaws found Scar's throat and locked with a grip that would not release until one of them was dead. Scar thrashed, clawed, fought with everything remaining in his fading strength, but Tucker held on through pain, through exhaustion, through the absolute certainty that he would die before he would let go. At 4:30 p.m. on December 2, 2020, Scar stopped moving. The last of Jabari's killers was dead. The 624-day hunt was complete. The debt had been paid in full. Tucker stood over Scar's body, breathing in ragged gasps, blood streaming from dozens of wounds. He roared again, a sound of triumph and grief mixed together, announcing to all of Magusi that justice had been delivered, that some bonds transcend death, that some sons never forget. He didn't feed on Scar's body this time. The symbolic message had been delivered with the previous 2 kills. This final act needed no additional statement. The death itself was enough. The rangers and researchers who had followed Tucker's impossible journey arrived to find him resting near Scar's body, surrounded by the lionesses who were now, once again, part of a pride ruled by Jabari's bloodline. His wounds were serious, but not life-threatening. He would recover. Dr. Sarah Chen's final research paper on what became known as the Magusi Revenge Campaign would become one of the most cited works in wildlife behavioral science. Over 624 days, a young male lion engaged in systematic elimination of 3 coalition members who had killed his father and usurped his birth territory. The campaign demonstrated 1. Long-term memory retention far exceeding previous estimates for lion cognition. 2. Strategic planning over extended time horizons. 3. Tactical flexibility and adaptive hunting techniques. 4. Psychological warfare through sustained presence and threat display. 5. Apparent goal-directed behavior sustained across nearly 2 years. These findings require fundamental reassessment of lion intelligence, emotional capacity, and cognitive capabilities. The behavior documented suggests lions may possess forms of consciousness and intentionality previously attributed only to great apes and humans. Joseph Mwenda, who had watched Tucker from that first terrible day when he lost his father, wrote in his personal journal, "Today I witnessed the completion of something I didn't believe possible when it began. A son avenged his father through a campaign that required more intelligence, patience, and determination than we thought lions capable of. Tucker has proven that these animals we study are far more complex than our science has admitted. He has rewritten what we thought we knew." Tucker went on to rule the Magusi territory for the next 4 years, becoming one of the most successful pride males in Ruaha National Park's recorded history. He fathered 18 cubs, 14 of whom survived to adulthood, a remarkable success rate that suggested the intelligence and strategic thinking he had developed during his revenge campaign translated into exceptional protective and territorial abilities. The lionesses who had once been his father's, then briefly the coalition's, and finally his own, showed unusual loyalty to Tucker. Dr. Chen theorized this was because they recognized his victory, not as mere physical dominance, but as something more profound, proof that some bonds and some causes are worth any sacrifice. Ragnars noted that Tucker never ventured far from the area where his father had died. Every patrol brought him past that termite mound near Madonia Waterhole. Sometimes he would pause there, as if remembering, as if ensuring that the ground where Jabari fell would remain protected, honored, remembered. In July 2024, at 8 years old, Tucker finally left the Magusi territory, driven out by a coalition of 3 younger males in the same cycle that had driven his father out years before. But he left as a legend, having achieved something unprecedented in lion history and having proven that even in nature's cruelest corners, some form of justice can exist. The last confirmed sighting of Tucker was in November 2024, when he was observed in the borderlands where he had once survived as a young male. He was thinner, older, bearing the scars of a lifetime of battles, but his eyes still carried that same focused intensity that Joseph Mwenda had noted all those years ago. "He's still here," Joseph reported, "still surviving, still defying the odds. Once you've hunted the impossible and succeeded, I suppose everything else seems manageable." This story has spread far beyond Ruaha National Park. It's told to visitors, shared among conservation groups, studied by scientists, and debated by researchers who still struggle to fully explain what Taka accomplished. Some view it as evidence of advanced animal cognition. Others see it as an exceptional outlier, a one-in-a-million confluence of circumstances and individual ability. But for those who watched it unfold, who documented those 624 days of impossible pursuit, who witnessed the ghost become a hunter and then a king, the interpretation is simpler and more profound. Love, even in the animal kingdom, can transcend death. Memory can drive behavior across years. And sometimes, just sometimes, justice finds a way to exist even in the brutal honesty of the African wilderness. Taka's story reminds us that the animals we observe, study, and sometimes take for granted possess emotional depths we are only beginning to understand. That behind those amber eyes exists not just instinct and reaction, but something approaching what we might call soul. On December 2nd each year, rangers at Ruaha National Park pause to remember Jabari, the king who fell, and Taka, the son who refused to forget. They gather at that termite mound near Madonia Waterhole, and they share the story with visitors who want to understand that nature is not just about survival of the fittest, but about bonds that endure, purpose that sustains, and love that demands accounting. If this incredible true story moved you, please subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Share this video with anyone who believes animals are simple creatures, acting only on instinct. Tell them about Taka, the lion who proved that nature holds mysteries far deeper than we've ever imagined. And tell me in the comments, what do you think drove Taka through those 624 days? Was it memory, instinct, or something we don't yet have words for? Where in the world are you watching this from? The story of the ghost who became a king will continue to echo across the savannas of Africa for generations to come. And somewhere in those borderlands, a scarred old male lion still watches the horizon, still survives against the odds, still carrying the legacy of his father in every step he takes. Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of the most extraordinary true wildlife stories ever documented. Until next time, remember, nature is far more complex, far more emotional, and far more remarkable than we ever give it credit for.